The aircraft had 8 minutes of fuel left. 2 landing attempts had failed. 183 passengers knew this third approach was their last chance. There would be no fourth attempt. The pilots had exhausted every procedure they knew. Then a small voice from the cabin said, "I know why you're failing. My parent taught me how to fix this." Nobody expected those words to come from an 11-year-old child. The Valentine's Day sunrise was still struggling through thick coastal fog when Maya Chen's world changed forever. Trans-Global Flight 447 had been circling San Francisco for 40 agonizing minutes, and the digital clock on the seatback screen in front of her read 7:27 a.m. as Captain Robert Mitchell's voice came through the intercom with an edge that made her stomach tighten. She sat in seat 14C with her hands folded in her lap, watching the flight attendants move through the cabin with expressions they were trying desperately to keep neutral. She was 11 years old, small for her age, with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, and her father's aviation watch too large on her thin wrist. The watch that read exactly 7:27 a.m. on this Tuesday morning of February 14, 2006, the same watch that had been on his wrist when he died 6 months ago, in August 2005, testing the very procedures that might be the only thing that could save them now. To everyone around her, she looked like just another child who needed extra reassurance during this nightmare unfolding at 30,000 feet. The elderly woman in 14B had been trying to comfort her since the first aborted landing attempt, patting her hand and telling her in a grandmother's soothing voice that everything would be fine, that pilots knew what they were doing, that she shouldn't be frightened. The businessman in 14A had offered her his phone to call her family, assuming she was traveling alone and terrified. Flight attendants had checked on her repeatedly with the extra concern reserved for unaccompanied minors during emergencies, speaking in gentle tones designed to shield children from understanding just how dire their situation had become. Nobody knew she was probably the most qualified person on the aircraft to solve the problem that had already defeated 2 landing attempts. The intercom crackled with Captain Robert Mitchell's voice, and Maya heard something in his tone that most passengers wouldn't recognize, the barely controlled edge of a man who had run out of options and was facing the mathematics of his own mortality. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." He paused, and in that hesitation Maya heard 40 years of flying experience confronting a situation that experience couldn't solve. "We're going to make our final approach into San Francisco International. I need to be completely honest with you. We don't have fuel for another attempt. This is it." The cabin went absolutely silent. Even the crying that had punctuated the previous 2 aborted approaches stopped as passengers processed what "this is it" actually meant. Maya felt the elderly woman's hand tighten around hers, felt the tremor in those aged fingers as the reality penetrated whatever comforting illusions people had been maintaining. "Our landing gear has partially deployed but won't lock into position," the captain continued, his voice steady but stripped of the reassuring cadence pilots usually maintain during emergencies. "Our hydraulic systems have failed. We've tried everything in our emergency procedures during our first 2 approaches. We've consulted with our maintenance teams on the ground. We've attempted every backup system this aircraft has." Another pause, longer this time, and Maya could almost hear him gathering courage to say the next words. "We're down to 8 minutes of fuel. That gives us 1 approach, 1 chance to get this right. If we have to abort this attempt, we won't have fuel to circle again. Emergency crews are standing by on the runway. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing. I need everyone in brace position when we begin final descent." Maya looked around the cabin and saw the moment understanding truly hit people. A woman 3 rows up began sobbing openly, her teenage daughter holding her while trying not to cry herself. A man across the aisle was gripping his wife's hands so hard his knuckles had gone white, and they were leaning their foreheads together, whispering words that might have been prayers or might have been final "I love yous." A businessman who had been typing on his laptop during the first 2 aborted approaches had finally closed it and was staring straight ahead with the blank expression of someone forcing himself not to think about what came next. Parents were holding their children, couples were embracing, and throughout the cabin Maya could see people pulling out phones to type final messages to family members who wouldn't receive them until after whatever happened next had already happened. The flight attendants had stopped pretending this was routine. Senior Flight Attendant Jennifer Martinez moved through first class with tears streaming down her face that she wasn't bothering to hide anymore, helping people adjust their seatbelts, speaking in low, urgent tones about brace positions and emergency exit procedures. When she reached business class, Maya watched her pause at a young mother with an infant, watched Jennifer's professional composure crack completely as she knelt down to help secure the baby's carrier, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. By the time Jennifer reached Maya's row, she had composed herself somewhat, but her eyes were red and her voice shook as she knelt down beside the 11-year-old girl and took her small hand in both of hers. "Sweetheart, I need you to listen very carefully," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "When the captain tells us, you're going to lean forward and put your head between your knees, like this." She demonstrated the brace position. "And you're going to stay like that until the plane completely stops moving. Can you do that for me?" Maya nodded, looking at Jennifer with dark eyes that seemed too calm, too focused for a child facing what everyone aboard understood might be the last minutes of their lives. "I understand the brace position," she said quietly. "But I need to tell you something important. I need to talk to the captain." Jennifer's expression shifted to one of gentle sympathy mixed with heartbreak. She'd seen this before during emergencies, children regressing, needing to talk to authority figures, looking for someone to tell them everything would be okay when nobody could promise that anymore. "Honey, the captain is very busy right now trying to land the plane. Is there something I can help you with? Are you scared?" "That's completely normal." "I'm not scared," Maya interrupted, and something in her tone made Jennifer pause. "I mean, I am scared, but that's not why I need to talk to him. My father was David Chen. He was a test pilot. He developed emergency landing procedures for situations exactly like this one. I know why your first two approaches failed, and I know what the captain needs to do differently on this third attempt." Jennifer stared at her, clearly trying to process whether this was a child's fantasy, a trauma response, or possibly something real. The elderly woman in 14B had been listening and now interjected gently. "Sweetheart, I know you're frightened, but the pilots know what they're doing. The approach angle is wrong." Maya continued, her voice growing more urgent as she looked at Jennifer. "With partial gear deployment and no hydraulics, conventional glide slope calculations don't account for the asymmetric drag profile. Every standard emergency procedure assumes either full gear or no gear, not this partial configuration. My father spent 3 years researching unconventional approaches for exactly this scenario. He proved that the standard procedures won't work. But nobody in commercial aviation would listen to him, because his techniques violate safety margins that assume you'll have another chance to try again." Jennifer's mouth had fallen open slightly. The technical precision in the child's words was impossible to dismiss as imagination. The businessman in 14A had turned around and was listening now with sharp attention. Was David Chen your father?" "The test pilot. He died 6 months ago testing advanced emergency procedures," Maya said, and her voice wavered for just a moment before steadying again. "But he taught me everything. He started when I was 6 years old. He said someday his research might save lives, even if the industry wouldn't officially adopt it. Please, I need to talk to the captain before he begins the final approach. Once he commits to the descent profile, there won't be time to change the technique." A voice from across the aisle interrupted, a middle-aged man in a suit who had been listening with growing attention. "I'm Martin Reeves, aerospace engineer with Lockheed Martin. I knew David Chen. I attended his presentation on unconventional landing geometries at the AIAA conference in 2004. He was looking at Maya with an expression of dawning realization mixed with shock. "You're his daughter. He used to bring you to the conferences. He said he was teaching you everything he knew. I didn't realize he meant." He turned to Jennifer with sudden urgency. "Get this girl to the cockpit. Now, if she knows even half of what David was working on, she might actually be able to help them." "But she's 11 years old," Jennifer protested, even as she was clearly reconsidering her initial dismissal. "David Chen was one of the most brilliant test pilots in the country," Martin said firmly. "His research on unconventional emergency procedures was groundbreaking. The industry wouldn't adopt it because it was too risky, too far outside standard protocols. But that doesn't mean it wasn't valid." He looked at Maya intently. "Tell me something specific. What was your father's core theory about partial gear landings?" Maya met his eyes steadily. "That conventional approaches fail because they assume symmetrical drag and adequate control authority. With partial gear and hydraulic failure, You have neither. The standard 3-degree glide slope requires precise lateral control that failed hydraulics can't provide, and the energy management calculations don't work when one side of the aircraft has gear drag and the other doesn't. My father proved that you need a completely different approach geometry, specifically a spiral descent that manages energy through bank angle rather than through conventional speed and glide slope control. Martin's eyes widened. The spiral energy bleed approach. He showed me the simulations. He said he tested it successfully but could never get FAA approval because it violated too many standard operating procedures. He turned back to Jennifer. She knows what she's talking about. This isn't a child's imagination. The 7:29 a.m. Sunday was breaking through the fog in golden shafts as Jennifer made a decision that violated every protocol, but seemed like the only rational choice in a situation where conventional protocols had already failed twice. She grabbed the phone from its cradle and called the cockpit directly, her hand trembling as she pressed the buttons. "Captain Mitchell, this is Jennifer in the main cabin. I have a situation that sounds impossible, but I need you to hear me out." She took a breath. "I have an 11-year-old passenger who claims her father was test pilot David Chen, and that she knows why our approaches are failing. There's an aerospace engineer here from Lockheed Martin who confirms her father was a recognized expert in unconventional emergency procedures. Sir, she's speaking with technical precision that doesn't sound like a child making things up. She says she knows what you need to do differently." There was a long pause from the cockpit, and Maya could hear the tension in the silence, could imagine the captain processing this absurd information while his fuel gauge showed 7 minutes remaining and his options had run out 40 minutes ago. Then Captain Mitchell's exhausted voice came through, rougher than the professional tone he'd maintained over the intercom. "We have 7 minutes of fuel and I've already tried everything I know." "Everything. Send her up." The cockpit door opened 30 seconds later, and Maya stepped into the cramped space where Captain Robert Mitchell and First Officer Sarah Vega were surrounded by warning lights that painted their faces in red and amber, alarm sounds that created a constant backdrop of urgency, and the kind of controlled chaos that represented two experienced pilots who had exhausted every option their combined 70 years of flying had taught them. Captain Mitchell turned in his seat to look at the small girl standing in his cockpit doorway, and his expression was a complicated mixture of desperation, skepticism, and the kind of openness that only comes when a man has accepted he's out of answers. He was 62 years old, with silver hair and deep lines around his eyes, a decorated former Air Force pilot who had logged more than 30,000 hours in everything from fighters to commercial jets. He had landed aircraft with engine failures, hydraulic problems, electrical fires, and once even a bird strike that had taken out both engines. He had trained for every conceivable emergency scenario in simulators that could replicate any disaster. And now he was looking at an 11-year-old child as possibly his last hope. "You have 5 minutes to convince me," he said simply, his voice stripped of any pretense or cushioning. "Tell me why our approaches failed." Maya moved to stand between the two pilots where she could see the instrument panel, and her eyes scanned the displays with practiced efficiency that made both pilots exchange a glance. She saw the airspeed indicator, the altitude, the fuel gauge showing critically low levels, the warning lights indicating partial gear deployment and complete hydraulic failure. She saw the approach profile displayed on the navigation screen, saw the damage status indicators, and understood in that moment exactly what her father had spent 6 years preparing her for. When she spoke, her voice was steady and technical, stripped of any childish uncertainty, channeling every lesson her father had drilled into her during countless hours in simulators and small aircraft and technical discussions that had seemed like elaborate games until right now, when she understood they had been preparation for exactly this moment. "Your first approach failed because you followed standard emergency gear down procedures with a 3-degree glide slope at 140 knots, she said, pointing at the navigation display where the previous approach path was still visible. But with partial gear deployment creating asymmetric drag on the left side and no hydraulics for flight control compensation, that approach angle required control surface authority you don't have. The aircraft was tracking off center line because the rudder couldn't compensate for the asymmetric drag. You had to abort because the aircraft was 4 degrees off center line at 500 feet, with insufficient control response to correct, and you recognized you'd either miss the runway or touch down sideways." Captain Mitchell's eyes widened. Every word she'd said was accurate technical detail that shouldn't be accessible to anyone who hadn't been in this cockpit for the past 40 minutes watching the first approach fail exactly the way she was describing. First Officer Vega was staring at Maya with her mouth slightly open. How could you possibly know our exact drift angle? Your second approach, Maya continued, not pausing, because she could see the fuel gauge and knew time was the one thing they didn't have. You tried compensating by increasing speed to 150 knots to improve control authority and decrease the time the aircraft spent in the unstable approach phase. But that increased your sink rate beyond what partial gear can handle on touchdown. The deployed gear isn't designed to absorb landing energy at high sink rates. The strut compression would have collapsed the gear and sent you cartwheeling down the runway. You aborted at 200 feet when you recognized the sink rate was 1,000 feet per minute and accelerating, and you knew impact at that rate would be catastrophic. Captain Mitchell was gripping his control yoke so hard his knuckles were white. Who told you our abort altitudes? Who's been talking to you? Nobody told me, Maya said. I knew because my father tested this exact scenario 43 times. He documented every approach, every failure mode, every reason conventional procedures don't work with this specific combination of failures. He proved that standard emergency techniques have a 0% success rate with partial gear deployment and complete hydraulic failure. 0%, Captain. Your two approaches didn't fail because you did anything wrong. They failed because what you're trying to do is aerodynamically impossible using conventional techniques. The cockpit was silent except for the steady alarm tones and the sound of Captain Mitchell's breathing, which had become faster and shallower as he processed what this child was telling him. That his 40 years of experience, his thousands of successful landings, his encyclopedic knowledge of emergency procedures, all of it was insufficient for this specific situation. Then what do we do? First Officer Vega asked, and her voice carried the first edge of real panic since the emergency began. If conventional approaches don't work, what the hell are we supposed to do? The spiral energy bleed approach, Maya said, and now she moved closer to the instrument panel, her small fingers pointing at the navigation display. My father developed it specifically for situations where conventional approaches failed due to asymmetric configuration and inadequate control authority. Instead of a straight-in approach that requires precise lateral tracking, you spiral down directly over the runway threshold. You use a steep bank angle, 45 degrees exactly, at low speed, 95 knots. The spiral lets you bleed off altitude and energy simultaneously while keeping the aircraft directly over your landing point, which eliminates the need for precise lateral control. That's insane, First Officer Vega said flatly. 45 degrees of bank at 95 knots at low altitude with no hydraulics, we'll stall. The stall speed with this configuration has to be at least 100 knots. And a spiral approach puts us in a continuous descending turn with zero margin for error. If we misjudge the turn radius or the energy bleed rate even slightly, we either overshoot the runway entirely or we're too high and too fast on final, with no way to correct. The stall speed is 92 knots with your current configuration, Maya said with absolute certainty, and she pulled a small notebook from her pocket, worn and dog-eared, filled with her father's handwriting and diagrams. My father calculated it based on the exact drag profile you're experiencing, wing loading, asymmetric drag coefficient, the additional drag from partial gear deployment. He documented everything. And yes, there's zero margin for error, which is exactly why commercial aviation won't teach this technique. It requires perfect execution with no safety margin for mistakes. But perfect execution has a 100% success rate. Your conventional approaches have a 0% success rate with this damage. You've already proved that twice. Captain Mitchell reached out and took the notebook from her hands, flipping through pages filled with technical calculations, diagrams of spiral approach geometries, tables of speeds and bank angles and descent rates. His hands were shaking slightly as he read, and Maya watched his expression transform from skepticism to shock to something like awe. These calculations are, he looked up at her, your father really tested this. Actually flew this profile 43 times, Maya said quietly, and for the first time her composure cracked slightly as she talked about her father. In simulators and in actual aircraft with simulated failures. He died on the 44th test, when a hydraulic line failed differently than expected during the spiral and he couldn't recover. It was 6 months ago. She touched the watch on her wrist. But the 43 successful tests proved the technique works. He documented everything in that notebook. The spiral approach succeeds when conventional approaches fail, but it demands precision that most pilots won't attempt, because one mistake is fatal and there's no way to abort once you commit. The cockpit was silent except for the alarms. Captain Mitchell looked at his fuel gauge again. 6 minutes remaining. Then at First Officer Vega, whose face had gone pale. Then back at this 11-year-old girl who had just presented him with research that simultaneously represented a possible solution and the most terrifying approach technique he'd ever considered attempting. "If I do this," he said slowly, his voice careful and measured, "if I put this aircraft into a 45-degree bank at 95 knots at low altitude with no hydraulics and partial gear, I'm trusting your father's research with 183 lives, including yours, including mine, including every person on this aircraft who trusts me to get them down safely. And if the technique fails, if your father's calculations are wrong, or if I execute it incorrectly, we don't have fuel to abort and try anything else. We crash. Everyone dies." Maya met his eyes with a directness that was unsettling from someone so young. "If you do another conventional approach, Captain, you'll abort again, because the same problems that caused the first 2 failures still exist. Or you'll try to force a landing that the aircraft can't physically accomplish, and you'll crash trying. My father proved mathematically that conventional approaches have 0 success probability with your specific failure configuration. 0. The spiral approach has risks, significant risks, but it actually has a success probability above 0. That's the only real choice you have." First Officer Vega interjected, her voice tight with stress. "But even if the approach technique works, we still have to touch down. With partial gear, how are we supposed to?" "You don't flare," Maya said immediately. "That's critical. Every instinct will tell you to pull back and reduce sink rate on touchdown, but with partial gear, flaring will cause the deployed gear to touch first while the other side is still in the air. The asymmetric touchdown will flip you. You have to fly it straight onto the runway at a high sink rate, about 1,000 feet per minute. The deployed gear will collapse on impact, but the aircraft will slide on its belly, and the fuselage structure will absorb the energy. It'll be rough, but it's survivable. My father tested the impact loads. He proved the airframe can handle it." Captain Mitchell was reading through the notebook again, his trained pilot's mind processing the calculations and recognizing their validity, even as every instinct screamed that this was too risky, too far outside standard procedures, too dependent on perfect execution. He had built a 40-year career on following procedures, on trusting proven techniques, on never attempting anything in an actual aircraft that hadn't been thoroughly tested and validated by thousands of previous pilots. And now he was being asked to attempt something that had been tested exactly 43 times by one unconventional test pilot, and would be taught to him by that pilot's 11-year-old daughter. He made a decision that would be debated by aviation investigators, safety boards, and industry panels for years afterward. He turned to First Officer Vega and said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was committing to, "Get ground control on the line. Tell them we're attempting an unconventional approach procedure. Tell them we're taking guidance from a passenger with specialized expertise in emergency landing techniques. Tell them to have every emergency vehicle they've got standing by, because this either works perfectly or it doesn't work at all. And tell them," he paused, "tell them if this works, they need to review David Chen's research, because apparently we've been missing something important in our emergency training." First Officer Vega stared at him for a long moment, then nodded and reached for the radio. "Ground control, this is Trans Global 447. Be advised, we are attempting a non-standard approach based on specialized emergency procedure research. Request all available emergency equipment standing by." At 7:32 a.m., with 5 minutes of fuel remaining and the fog beginning to burn off under the strengthening sun, Captain Mitchell pushed the control yoke forward and began the turn that would position Flight 447 over the approach end of runway 28L. Maya stood between the pilots, her small hands gripping the back of the captain's seat, her father's watch reading 7:32 as she began providing guidance that would either save everyone aboard or kill them all. "Reduce speed to 110 knots, she said, her voice calm with a forced steadiness that she'd learned from her father during hundreds of hours in simulators and small aircraft, during technical discussions where he'd made her explain procedures until she could recite them perfectly, during practice sessions where he drilled emergency responses until they became automatic. Position directly over the runway threshold at 3,000 feet. When I say start the spiral, I need you to bank 45 degrees to the left. That's away from your deployed gear side, which gives you better control authority, because the deployed gear is creating drag on the left, and banking away from it reduces the control inputs needed. The Boeing 767 slowed and turned, positioning itself above the end of the runway, and Maya could feel the aircraft's unstable response to every control input. The partial gear was creating asymmetric drag that wanted to pull them sideways with every adjustment. The failed hydraulics meant the control surfaces responded with dangerous delay. Captain Mitchell moved the yoke, and there was a perceptible lag before the aircraft reacted, and even then the response was sluggish and imprecise. She could feel everything her father had taught her coming into focus. All those hours he'd made her close her eyes in small aircraft and describe what the plane was doing by sound and vibration alone. All those technical discussions about energy states and drag profiles that had seemed abstract until right now, when she could feel the aircraft's energy state through the seat of her pants and understand exactly what needed to happen next. Start the spiral, she said, her voice cutting through the cockpit noise with clear authority. 45 degrees left bank, maintain 100 knots, begin descent at 1,200 feet per minute. Captain Mitchell took a breath that Maya could hear even over the alarms, and then he rolled the aircraft into a bank angle that every instinct told him was suicidal at low altitude with this many system failures. The aircraft tilted steeply, the runway rotating below them in a spiral that put them in a continuous descending turn with the ground rushing up and no margin for error. Through the windscreen, the world was tilted at an impossible angle, the runway spinning below them, and Mitchell's instruments showed him descending in a turn that violated every safety protocol he'd ever learned. Too much bank, Maya said immediately, her eyes locked on the bank angle indicator. You're at 48 degrees. Reduce to 45 exactly. The bank angle is critical for the energy bleed calculations. Too steep and you'll descend too fast and overshoot the runway. Too shallow and you won't bleed enough energy and you'll be too fast on final. Mitchell adjusted with minute control inputs, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly through the failed hydraulic systems. The artificial horizon showed 45 degrees exactly, and he held it there with constant pressure on the yoke, fighting the aircraft's tendency to roll further due to the asymmetric drag. First Officer Vega was calling out altitude in a tight voice that betrayed her stress. 2,500 feet. Descent rate 1,300 feet per minute. Speed 102 knots. Speed is too high, Maya said, not looking away from the instruments. Reduce power slightly. You need exactly 100 knots for the turn radius calculations to work. If you're too fast by even 3 knots, you'll spiral outside the runway boundaries and you won't be lined up for touchdown. If you're too slow, you'll stall before you complete the turn and you'll spin in. Mitchell pulled back the throttles with a precision born of 4 decades of flying, feeling the aircraft slow to the knife-edge speed that Maya's father had apparently proved was the only speed that worked. They were spiraling down now, the runway rotating below them in a dizzying descent that every safety protocol said was impossible to execute successfully, especially with failed hydraulics and partial gear creating unpredictable handling characteristics. 2,000 feet, Vega called out, her voice shaking now. Descent rate 1,000 feet per minute. Speed 100 knots. Bank angle 45 degrees. Perfect, Maya said, and there was tension in her voice, but also a note of confidence that seemed impossible given their situation. Maintain exactly this profile. Don't let the bank angle drift. The turn radius has to stay constant. Don't let the speed vary more than 1 knot. The descent rate will fluctuate slightly due to the spiral dynamics, but as long as you're between 950 and 1,150 feet per minute, you're within acceptable parameters. Mitchell was flying with a concentration he'd rarely needed in his career. His entire focus narrowed to 3 instruments: bank angle, airspeed, descent rate. Every other warning and alarm faded into background noise. His hands made constant tiny corrections on the yoke and throttles, keeping the aircraft locked in this spiral that was carrying them down through 1,500 feet, the ground coming up fast, emergency vehicles visible on the runway edges in a formation that looked like they were expecting a crash, their lights flashing as they watched this impossible approach that violated everything they'd been trained to expect. 1,200 feet, Vega said, and now her voice was almost a whisper. Speed 100 knots. Descent rate 1,000 feet per minute. Bank 45 degrees. Maintain profile, Maya said, her eyes moving constantly between instruments and the view through the windscreen, where the runway was rotating below them. At 800 feet, start monitoring for the rollout point. At 500 feet you'll begin rolling out of the bank gradually, not all at once. That'll cause a ballooning effect you don't have power to control, and it'll put you too high on final. You need to reduce bank angle at exactly 2 degrees per second, which will take approximately 22 seconds to roll wings level. During the rollout you'll need to reduce power proportionally, because reducing bank reduces the load factor and the aircraft will want to accelerate. They were at 1,000 feet now, spiraling down in a maneuver that Captain Mitchell had never attempted in 40 years of flying, trusting calculations from a dead test pilot delivered through his 11-year-old daughter. The runway was rotating below them like a carousel, coming up fast, and Mitchell had time to think that if this failed, they would hit in a descending spiral at over 100 knots that would obliterate the aircraft and kill everyone aboard instantly, and the investigation would focus not on the impossible situation he'd faced, but on his decision to trust a child with 183 lives. 800 feet, Vega called out. 700 feet, 600 feet, 500 feet, Maya announced. Start rolling out now, 2 degrees per second. Watch your power. Reduce throttle proportionally as bank decreases. Maintain 100 knots. Mitchell began the rollout, his hands moving with practiced smoothness despite the sweat running down his face and the knowledge that any mistake in the next 20 seconds would kill everyone. He rolled the bank angle down degree by degree, simultaneously reducing power to maintain speed, feeling the aircraft respond with agonizing slowness through the failed hydraulics. The runway was no longer rotating, it was ahead of them now, appearing through the windscreen as they rolled toward wings level. He realized with shock that they were perfectly aligned with the center line, at what looked like the right altitude, at what felt like the right speed. 400 feet, Vega said, her voice rising with something that might have been hope. Bank 30 degrees, speed 100 knots, descent rate 800 feet per minute. Continue roll out, Maya said, her voice steady. Don't rush it, 2 degrees per second, you're doing perfectly. 300 feet, Vega said. Bank 15 degrees, wings coming level. Bank 10 degrees, 5 degrees, wings level. Speed 100 knots, descent rate 800 feet per minute. We're lined up, we're actually lined up perfectly. Now reduce power to flight idle, Maya said urgently. Let the descent rate increase to 1,000 feet per minute. You need the extra sink rate, because with partial gear you can't flare. Normally, if you try to flare, the deployed gear will touch first and you'll cartwheel. You're going to touch down hard. Harder than any landing you've ever made, but the high sink rate puts you down in the touchdown zone instead of floating halfway down the runway, where you'd run out of pavement. That sink rate will collapse the gear, Vega protested. But Mitchell was already pulling the throttles to idle, because he understood now that this child knew exactly what she was talking about, that her father had calculated every aspect of this approach, including the touchdown dynamics, that conventional wisdom about landing sink rates didn't apply when you were trying to land with partial gear that couldn't absorb normal loads anyway and would collapse regardless of how gently you touched down. 200 feet, Vega said, her voice nearly breaking. 1,000 feet per minute sink rate. Speed 98 knots. 150 feet. 100 feet. Don't flare, Maya said with desperate urgency, knowing that 40 years of flying instinct would be screaming at Captain Mitchell to pull back, to reduce sink rate, to make it a smooth landing. This is critical, Captain. Don't pull back, just fly it onto the runway. Let it hit hard. The deployed gear will collapse, but that's supposed to happen. The belly landing is part of the design. If you flare, the asymmetric gear will catch first and flip you. 50 feet, Vega said, and now she was crying openly. 40 feet, 30 feet. Captain Mitchell fought every instinct developed over 30,000 hours of flying as he watched the runway rushing up at a sink rate that would normally be considered a crash. His hands wanted to pull back on the yoke, wanted to flare and cushion the touchdown, wanted to make this a landing instead of what looked like a controlled crash. But he kept the nose down, kept the power at idle, trusted this child who had guided them with her father's research. And at exactly 7:36 a.m. on Valentine's Day morning, 2006, Trans-Global Flight 447 hit runway 28L with a violent impact that shattered the partially deployed landing gear and sent the Boeing 767 sliding down the runway on its belly, in a shower of sparks and a screech of metal on concrete and the smell of friction and burning. The aircraft slid for 4,200 feet, an eternity of noise and terror and violence, before friction and the remnants of the destroyed gear brought it to a grinding, shuddering halt 700 feet from the end of the runway. For a moment there was stunned silence in the cockpit, broken only by the wail of alarms and the crackle of flames beginning somewhere behind them. Then emergency vehicles surrounded them within seconds, foam covering the aircraft, fire suppression systems activating, evacuation slides deploying with sharp bangs, and Captain Mitchell was on the radio calling for evacuation while First Officer Vega was already out of her seat, opening the cockpit door to help direct passengers to exits. Maya sat on the floor of the cockpit where she'd collapsed when the aircraft hit, her whole body shaking with delayed terror and relief and the overwhelming realization that it had worked. Her father's technique had actually worked. Her father's watch showed 7:37 a.m., 1 minute after the touchdown that had seemed impossible but had saved 183 lives, because David Chen had spent 3 years developing unconventional procedures and 6 years teaching them to his daughter. Captain Mitchell turned in his seat and looked down at her with tears streaming down his weathered face, and his voice broke as he said simply, "You saved us. Your father saved us." The evacuation took 8 minutes. 183 passengers slid down the emergency chutes into the arms of firefighters and paramedics, shaken and bruised, but alive. 13 people had minor injuries from the hard landing, a broken arm, several bruised ribs, 1 concussion from luggage falling from overhead bins, but nobody died. Not one person. In a situation where conventional approaches had failed twice and fuel exhaustion left no margin for error, Maya Chen had guided the pilots through her father's unconventional technique and delivered everyone safely to the ground. The investigation took 6 months and involved every aviation expert the NTSB could assemble. They brought in test pilots, aerospace engineers, landing dynamics specialists, human factors researchers. They reconstructed the entire emergency from cockpit voice recordings that captured Maya's calm technical guidance and Captain Mitchell's agonized decision to trust her. They analyzed flight data that showed the spiral approach parameters matching her father's calculations with remarkable precision. They interviewed all 183 passengers and every member of the flight crew. And they located David Chen's research files. The files were stored in Maya's home, carefully preserved by her aunt, who had been David's sister and who had watched him spend years developing procedures that the aviation industry dismissed as too unconventional. Thousands of pages of calculations filled filing cabinets, mathematical models of asymmetric drag profiles, spiral descent energy management equations, landing impact load analysis for partial gear scenarios. Test flight data documented 43 successful demonstrations of the spiral energy bleed approach in aircraft ranging from small single-engine planes to modified commercial jets. Simulator records showed hundreds of additional trials refining the technique. The NTSB brought in independent test pilots who reviewed David Chen's work with growing astonishment. They confirmed what had seemed impossible. David Chen had developed genuinely innovative emergency procedures that worked in situations where standard techniques failed. His spiral approach technique violated multiple standard operating procedures and required perfect execution with zero margin for error, but the mathematics were sound and the test results were undeniable. The final investigation report concluded that conventional emergency procedures would have resulted in either continued aborted approaches until fuel exhaustion or an attempted landing that would have crashed with total loss of life. The spiral energy bleed approach violated safety protocols designed for situations where multiple attempts were possible, but succeeded in a situation where only one attempt remained and conventional approaches had demonstrably failed. The report noted that David Chen's technique required extraordinary skill and precision that exceeded typical commercial pilot training, and it recommended against incorporation into standard procedures due to the high risk and lack of safety margins. But it also noted that in situations where conventional procedures have failed and no alternatives exist, unconventional techniques with documented success records should be considered as last resort options. The NTSB recommended that David Chen's research be preserved and made available to emergency response teams, test pilot programs, and simulator training facilities for situations where standard procedures proved inadequate. They acknowledged that while his techniques were too risky for routine training, they represented valuable knowledge for impossible emergencies where normal rules no longer applied. Captain Robert Mitchell retired 6 months after the incident, at age 63. He gave limited interviews, but in one televised appearance he said, "I've been flying for 40 years. I've logged 30,000 hours. I thought I knew everything about emergency procedures, every technique, every option. An 11-year-old girl taught me that there's always something more to learn, and that the most important thing a pilot can do is recognize when conventional wisdom isn't working and have the courage to try something different." David Chen developed procedures that saved 183 lives. His daughter had the courage to insist we use them when I'd run out of my own answers. "I'll be grateful to both of them for the rest of my life." First Officer Sarah Vega went on to become a captain herself, and later an instructor in advanced emergency procedures. She incorporated lessons from Flight 447 into her training programs, particularly focusing on recognition of when standard procedures aren't working and the importance of seeking alternative approaches before running out of options. She kept in touch with Maya over the years, writing letters of recommendation for her college applications and later attending her graduation from MIT's aerospace engineering program. Martin Reeves, the Lockheed Martin aerospace engineer who had recognized David Chen's name and urged Jennifer to take Maya to the cockpit, spent 2 years documenting David's research in professional publications. He wrote papers analyzing the spiral energy bleed approach and other unconventional techniques, presented them at conferences, and worked to ensure David's contributions were recognized within the industry, even if not officially adopted. He established a foundation in David Chen's name to fund research into emergency procedures that existed outside conventional training, believing that innovation often came from those willing to question standard practices. Jennifer Martinez, the senior flight attendant who made the impossible decision to send an 11-year-old passenger to the cockpit during final approach, was initially investigated for violating protocol. But after the full story emerged, after investigators understood that Maya's knowledge had genuinely saved the flight, she was instead recognized for making a courageous decision under impossible circumstances. She continued flying for another 12 years before retiring, and she never forgot the Valentine's Day morning when trusting a child's expertise had been the difference between disaster and survival. Maya Chen was interviewed extensively by investigators, psychologists evaluating her capability to provide the guidance she'd given, and journalists fascinated by the story of the 11-year-old who had saved a commercial flight. Everyone who met her came away convinced that David Chen had spent 6 years giving his daughter an education in aviation that exceeded most professional pilots' training. They found her calm under pressure, technically precise, and carrying both the burden and the pride of having her father's controversial research prove its value by saving 183 lives. But the most important conversations happened privately, with the child psychologist who worked with Maya in the months after the emergency, helping her process the weight of what had happened and what it meant. "I used to wonder why my dad spent so much time teaching me all that technical stuff," Maya said during one session 3 weeks after the incident, sitting in a comfortable chair in the psychologist's office and holding the aviation watch that was still too large for her wrist. "Other kids were doing soccer and piano lessons and sleepovers, and I was in flight simulators learning about asymmetric drag profiles and emergency energy management. Sometimes I thought it was weird, like, why did an 11-year-old need to know how to calculate spiral descent rates? Why did I need to memorize stall speeds for different aircraft configurations? And now," the psychologist asked gently, her voice carefully neutral. "Now I understand he was giving me everything he had," Maya said, and her voice broke slightly. "He knew his research was important. He knew conventional procedures had gaps that could kill people. And he knew the aviation industry might not adopt his techniques, because they were too risky, too far outside standard protocols, too dependent on perfect execution. So he taught me, just in case. Just in case someday someone needed what he'd learned." She looked down at the watch, running her finger over the scratched crystal. "He died testing the 44th spiral approach. The technique that saved Flight 447 is the same technique that killed him. I don't know how to feel about that." "You can feel complicated things," the psychologist said. "Pride and grief, gratitude and anger, loss and purpose, all at the same time." "I miss him so much," Maya said quietly, tears finally coming after weeks of keeping them contained. "Every single day, I miss him explaining things at the dinner table. I miss him taking me to airports to watch landings and explaining what the pilots were doing. I miss sitting in simulators with him and practicing emergency procedures that I thought were just games. Her voice broke completely. I miss my dad. The psychologist let her cry, let the grief flow that Maya had been holding back during interviews and investigations and all the attention that had made her into a public figure when all she wanted was to be a normal 11-year-old girl whose father hadn't died testing experimental procedures. But when I was in that cockpit, Maya continued after a while, wiping her eyes, it was like he was there with me. Every calculation, every procedure, every technical detail, it was his voice in my head, his hands guiding mine, his knowledge flowing through me. Those pilots trusted me because my dad trained me so well that I could explain complex aviation concepts like I've been flying for decades. All those people lived because he loved me enough to teach me everything he knew, even when it seemed excessive or unusual, or when people probably thought he was pushing me too hard. She touched the watch again, and when she looked up her eyes were red, but her voice was steadier. This was on his wrist when he died. The accident investigators gave it to me afterward. Now it's on mine, and I think that means something. Like he's still teaching me, still protecting people through what he taught me, still proving that his research mattered, even though the aviation industry wouldn't officially recognize it. Your father gave you an extraordinary gift, the psychologist said. Knowledge, skill, confidence, but also responsibility. That's a heavy weight for an 11-year-old to carry. I know, Maya said. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking about what would have happened if I'd made a mistake. If I'd given them the wrong bank angle, or the wrong speed, or if I'd forgotten some critical detail. Everyone would have died because of me. That's really hard to think about. But you didn't make a mistake, the psychologist pointed out. You remembered everything correctly. You guided them perfectly. You saved 183 lives. Because my dad taught me well enough that I couldn't make a mistake, Maya said. He drilled those procedures into me until they were automatic. He made me explain everything back to him until I could recite it perfectly, even when I was tired or distracted. He taught me like. He knew someday it would matter this much. She was quiet for a long moment, then continued in a softer voice. I'm not sorry I had to carry that weight. I'm not sorry he trained me so intensively. 183 people went home to their families because my dad spent 6 years teaching me how to save them. That's not a burden. That's love. That's the best kind of love there is. Love that keeps working even after someone dies. Love expressed through knowledge and preparation. Love that saves lives. The psychologist nodded slowly. That's a very mature way to look at it. My dad used to say that love isn't just about feelings, Maya said. It's about giving people the tools they need to survive and thrive, even when you're not there anymore. He gave me those tools. And on February 14th, those tools saved 183 people. That's how I want to remember him, not as someone who died doing something risky, but as someone whose love was so practical and so powerful that it continued saving lives even 6 months after he was gone. The sessions continued for months, helping Maya process the complicated emotions of being suddenly thrust into the public eye, of being called a hero when she felt like she was just using knowledge her father had given her, of carrying the weight of knowing that 183 people's lives had depended on her memory being perfect in a moment of extreme stress. But as the months passed and the intensity of public attention faded, Maya found herself settling into something like peace with what had happened. She couldn't change that her father had died. She couldn't change that she'd been on Flight 447 when it faced an impossible emergency. She couldn't change that she'd been thrust into a position where 183 lives depended on an 11-year-old remembering technical procedures perfectly. What she could do was honor her father's memory by valuing the knowledge he'd given her, by pursuing aviation as a career herself, by working to ensure his research was recognized and preserved, by becoming the kind of person who made his intensive training of her worthwhile. The sun had fully risen by the time Maya left one of her final sessions with the psychologist, 6 months after the incident, the August morning bright and warm. She walked outside, where her aunt was waiting to drive her home, and she looked up at a commercial jet passing overhead, leaving contrails across the blue sky. Somewhere up there, pilots were flying approaches that would probably never face the kind of emergency that Flight 447 had confronted. They would land safely using conventional procedures developed through decades of experience and refined through countless successful operations. That was how aviation usually worked. Proven techniques, careful adherence to procedures, safety margins built on safety margins, multiple opportunities to correct if something went wrong. But Maya Chen knew something those pilots might never learn. That sometimes conventional wisdom fails, that sometimes the most important knowledge exists outside standard training, that sometimes the courage to try something unconventional is the only thing standing between disaster and survival, and that love expressed through intensive teaching and preparation continues protecting people long after the teacher is gone. She touched her father's watch. 8:47 a.m. now, exactly 6 months and 14 days since the moment Flight 447 had touched down in that violent, perfect landing that shouldn't have worked but did. 6 months since 183 lives had been saved by techniques David Chen developed and taught to a daughter who loved him enough to absorb everything he had to give. The jet, overhead, completed its turn and lined up for its approach, descending toward the airport on a standard 3-degree glide slope at standard approach speed, following standard procedures that would result in a standard, safe landing. That was normal. That was how aviation usually worked. But Maya would never be normal again. She would carry her father's knowledge, his unconventional wisdom, his willingness to challenge conventional approaches when conventional approaches weren't working. She would carry the weight of having used that knowledge to save lives, and the responsibility to preserve what he taught her for whatever future emergency might require it. She was 11 years old, about to start 6th grade, with her whole life ahead of her. And she would spend it proving that sometimes the most qualified person is the one nobody would ever suspect, that love expressed through intensive training continues saving lives long after someone dies, and that the greatest gift a parent can give is the knowledge and courage to act when acting seems impossible but is absolutely necessary. Flight 447 had landed at 7:36 a.m. on Valentine's Day, 2006. 183 people lived because an 11-year-old girl learned her father's lessons well enough to teach them to experienced pilots when those pilots had run out of their own answers. That was the day Maya Chen understood that her father's unconventional research hadn't been strange or obsessive or unnecessarily risky. It had been love, expressed in the language of aviation. And that love had saved lives exactly the way he'd always hoped it would, through the daughter he trained to carry his knowledge into situations where that knowledge would make the difference between everyone living and everyone dying. She would honor that for the rest of her life.